to the big picture. For the first time in 2 years, the International Monetary Fund has cut India's growth forecast. It has also slashed the growth outlook for many of the other countries pretty much across the world based on the ramifications of the impending exit of the United Kingdom from the EU. We think it's a perfect time then to discuss the road ahead for India, especially since we're celebrating 25 years since India embarked on liberal market policies. And in fact, many say that that was indeed an inflection point in the history of our country. Today, I will be joined in moments from now by Vijay Joshi, Emeritus Fellow at the Merton College at the University of Oxford. His new book, India's Long Road, The Search for Prosperity, is out on the stands. I'm Ranajay Banerjee, and the Big Picture Special starts now. Well, the potential for India to become the world's next economic superpower has been furtively debated for long. Some say that India is a unique case where we have managed to disappoint both the optimists and the pessimists. In a book that has just recently hit the stands, India's Long Road, The Search for Prosperity, acclaimed economist and Emeritus Fellow at the Merton College at the Oxford University clearly lays down the reasons that have prevented India from reaching its full potential at a time when we are taking a lot of comfort in being the only bright star in an otherwise global economy. That's according to the IMF. Perhaps it's an important time to actually sit back and think, what are the impediments to our growth? Mr. Joshi, a pleasure to have you here on the big picture. You know, it's interesting because we hear policymakers, keep talking about how India will achieve 8% plus growth. You have said that even to achieve 6% plus growth is not going to be any easy. Tell us a little bit about it. What makes you think it's so that India will be tough for us?
Well, I think the point is that to achieve 6% or 7% growth per year for a short time is easy, and indeed India has done it for the last 3 decades. But to do more than that, to achieve 8% growth or 6% per capita growth, there are actually very few countries that have done it. Right. Only China, South Korea, and Taiwan have grown So
India has to be an exception in that
India
sense.
has to be
only
an exception.
few
India
examples.
has to be an exception. And remember that China is not a democracy.
Right.
And that South Korea and Taiwan were not democracies when they had their really fast growth phases.
Indeed.
So if India did it, I think it would be the first democracy to do it.
That's actually a very interesting point. So in effect, whatever growth we have seen so far, many would actually argue that India has actually eaten, swallowed, digested the low-hanging fruits.
Yes.
Many have said that the market reforms that India introduced in 1991 was not backed up by administrative governance reforms. Do you think that is where the bulk of the problem lies today?
I think the problem lies at several levels. But I would say one of the main things is that we haven't got right the relationship between the market, the state, and the private sector. This is something that each country has to do, has to find the right balance that suits its own circumstances. But we haven't managed to do that. For example, the state probably shouldn't be running as many commercial enterprises as it does. It should leave that to the private sector.
Right.
Another example is the fact that the state pays for something, for which there may be many good reasons, doesn't mean that it actually has to deliver those things. In other words, if it may certainly want to pay that so that people have food security, so that they can buy food, but it doesn't mean that it actually has to go and deliver the food to them, which is what it is doing now.
Which should be left to the private sector then?
The distribution could be left to the private sector. People could be given the money to buy it.
Let's unpack some of the arguments then that you've made, Professor, because, you have said that BSNL, MTNL, and Air India, 3 typical public sector behemoths, if you were to put it like that, their combined losses today is at over $3.5 billion per year. Yeah. In that sense, has this government, in a sense, disappointed you? Because there's many thought that this was the great Margaret Thatcher or a Ronald Reagan moment where Narendra Modi is going to come and take those hard economic decisions. Here, when it comes to disinvestment, government has been very, very cautious. Given these examples, are you disappointed with the government's report card, a 2-year report card that you've seen?
I would say the government's performance is decent, but underwhelming. So in that sense, I am disappointed. And what particularly disappoints me is that they are not nearly as good on this as their predecessors. In other words, the BJP government of 1999 to 2004.
Which government, according to you, was more reform-oriented than this present NDA too?
Certainly on the subject of privatization and disinvestment. I mean, Arun Shourie was the person who did much of the hard lifting there. And this government has not done nearly enough, even compared to them.
Right. You know, an important point that you made, you know, for which I think, you know, we've seen also many of the newspapers quoting you on that, which I thought was very interesting, is the fact that how we should go away from this culture of doling out subsidies. Instead, the government should give or set a minimum basic income.
Yes.
Just throw us some light on that.
Well, the point is the government, right now, what the government does is to redistribute income to people in a very inefficient way. It does it by giving them price subsidies. In other words, you sell electricity below cost, you sell fertilizers below cost, you sell water below cost. Now that has very bad effects on efficiency because no one wants to invest. But at the same time, the subsidy doesn't reach the poor. You subsidize food, but we know it doesn't reach the poor.
Right.
We know that fertilizers are subsidized, but the subsidy goes mostly to the rich farmers. We know that electricity is subsidized, but the benefit of the subsidy mostly goes to the rich. So it's not achieving the object.
So in a sense, many of the policies that the government has come up with over the years, they've been framed with the best of intentions.
Yes.
But somewhere, you know, it hasn't benefited for whom that was meant to in the first place.
That's correct. And therefore, my proposal would be that many of these subsidies, what I call non-merit subsidies, in other words, not subsidies on things we really want to do, like things that the private sector would not do. So you keep those. But if you abolish all these subsidies, you would release a huge amount of fiscal space, which could be used to give people a minimum basic income, everybody, a universal minimum basic income. So you don't have to identify the poor. Everyone gets it. And they can then buy the...
Can you give us some examples perhaps of somewhere around the world where, you know, where something like this has been tried at, or is it a completely novel idea that you think is sort of suitable for an India?
The idea is being talked about in lots of places. Indeed, there was a referendum in Switzerland just 6 weeks ago where the idea was defeated. So the Swiss didn't want it.
Right.
But of course, that's not surprising because the Swiss have such a marvelous social security system. Why would they want to have the upheaval of going to a minimum basic income?
Right.
I think the minimum basic income makes much more sense in a poor country.
Right.
See, in the rich countries, people are worried that if you give people a minimum basic income, they'd stop working and go and surf on the beaches of California. But that's not a problem in India. I mean, you are just lifting people up to the poverty line.
That's right.
They are not going to stop working because you brought them up to the poverty line. So that argument just falls to the ground.
Right. Well, another very interesting proposal that you've, or rather analysis that you've had, is for the labor market, where you say that there is an excess supply of low-skilled workers, okay, but demand there is low.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, when you talk about the high-skilled workers, there is excess demand, but supply is low, as a result of which that sort of increases their wages vis-a-vis the lower-skilled workers, and which has created this massive inequality. How then do you bridge that, sir?
Well, you have to act on both sides. In other words, you have to increase the supply of skilled labor, and you have to increase the demand for unskilled labor.
And for that, in that sense, the government has been trying to, again, bring the focus back, let's say, on the textile industry and the sector.
Correct.
Do you think measures like that are sort of on the other way forward?
I think the recent measures on textiles were a very encouraging start. I mean, they were excellent. There was an excellent measure. But you have to do that on quite a big scale. I mean, the thing to remember is that China is the world's leader in all these labor-intensive exports, including textiles. The labor costs in China are now rising very fast. And so China is vacating that space that it was occupying. And both Chinese investors and foreign investors in China, in these industries, are going to shift the location to elsewhere. The question is, are they going to come to India? Or is India going to take up that space? Or is the space going to be taken up by Bangladesh, Vietnam, who are already
Who
doing
are already
somewhat do better than
Bangladeshis,
India.
of course.
So, you know, I mean, there's a great opportunity for India right now in labor-intensive goods. The question is whether we can, you know,
Absolutely,
whether we can
can
get there.
catch the bull by the horns, and so to speak.
Yeah.
In fact, that is clearly the thinking behind also the government to actually give a boost to the textile industry. But also, let's talk a little bit about the need for labor reforms. You know, there are, I think, 50, 60 different kinds of acts, and I remember somebody said that it's impossible to follow all of them. As soon as you follow all of them, you'll realize that you're actually breaching something else. So that's how, it's like a spaghetti bowl of regulations, so to speak. But how do you create political consensus on labor reforms?
I think you create political, I mean, it is perfectly true, trade unions are not going to agree to labor reforms, you know, for a mess of pottage. I mean, they've got to be given something in exchange. And I think what you have to, if you want to reduce job security a little bit, which is what one is saying, then you have to give more income security. So, you know, they've got to feel that if they lose the job, they get good redundancy pay, much better than they do now. They get good retraining schemes. They have the minimum basic income that I'm talking about, so they never are completely destitute. So they have some unemployment insurance. We have to move towards that. So these are the, if you have a package which
A stronger social security net.
correct, which is there, then you can start having, but that has to be done at the same time. Then you can have labor market reforms, which are necessary.
You know, I was speaking with Yashwant Sinha last week, and he said that what is perplexing is that governments usually are very reform oriented. They want to bring in labor reforms, for instance, but politicians aren't. So there's this dichotomy. It almost sounds paradoxical.
Yes.
What explains that?
Well, I think what Yashwant Sinha may be getting at is that, firstly, that politicians behave differently from when their party is in power. In other words, the same party which was opposing certain things when it was in opposition takes them up when it comes to power, because its mission then is to serve the public interest, and that has some impact on its thinking. So the GST is a very good example. I mean, the BJP fought it tooth and nail when the Congress was trying to get it, and now we have.
But are Congress's concerns, the three concerns that they have raised, are they legitimate, especially when it comes to that 1% interstate tax and actually setting the constitutional limit as far as how much the GST rate can be? At least on those two important issues, do you think that their stance is legitimate?
Well, I think on that, my answer would be entirely legitimate on the first count.
1% interstate tax, that should go?
That should go,
right,
because that makes no sense at all.
Okay.
But on the other hand, to put completely wrong on the other count. I mean, the idea that you put a cap on the GST and enshrine it in the Constitution is not a sensible step at all.
Right. Hold that thought, Professor. Let's quickly slip into a break. On the other side, that's lots more with Professor Vijay Joshi. Don't go in.